My name is Sarah Jane Walker. I am a senior manager of communications here at LDS Learn, Develop, Succeed. And hi, Maria from South Surrey. Welcome. We're glad to have you join us for this community workshop on supporting your child with math anxiety. We're just going to be together for an hour, so we'll just whip through a few introductory pieces and then let Patrick join us to lead us in the workshop. We just want to acknowledge that we are here on the traditional ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and we are privileged and honored to continue to learn about reconciliation and how our actions as educators can both support justice and reconciliation towards these generous neighbors of ours. A little bit about LDS, Learn, Develop, Succeed. We are a 54-year-old nonprofit charity. We serve students, we say 3 to 103, so all the ages learners are the people that we serve. And one of our primary programs is our RISE one-to-one individualized instruction. So in that program, we specially pair each learner with an instructor to work on academics, social emotional learning, executive function, and see our students and learners grow in confidence. And it's a real privilege to work with those students across the province. In East Vancouver, in North Vancouver learning centers, we do also serve students on our mobile bus, which is just to my right here, which I can't quite show you. It's a bit dark out. And also online across the province. So I will introduce you to Patrick, who is here with us. And Patrick is one of our instructors who specializes, he'll say a little bit about himself, but he specializes in math. He's probably our lead instructor in mathematics, as well as our neuro-affirming program lead. So he can unpack that if he likes. But Patrick is a joy to watch around the center because he brings math alive for students. And there's a lot of fun and engagement and confidence building around math that we see in the center when Patrick's teaching. So I look forward to having him share with us tonight. Before I pass it on to Patrick, I would encourage you to pop some questions in the chat. If we're a smaller group, we had a large number of people register. If we're a smaller group, that's wonderful because we get to bring your specific questions. So don't be shy, pop some questions in there, and there'll be time for that afterwards as well, because we do want to hear from you. So Patrick, why don't you take it away and let us know what we're going to be talking about for the next little while.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah Jane. I just also want to say thank you to everybody who's here today. This is a topic that is very important to me, and because it comes up a lot with my students and it weighs pretty heavily on many of them. And many of my students don't have, especially when they first come in, have a very positive relationship with math here. And one of the things that I really enjoy about my job is getting to have these experiences with students and showing them ways that they can relate to math a little differently than they may have done in the past. I'm going to try to be brief when I talk about myself here and just go through a little bit of an intro. My name's Patrick. I have been teaching math for 12 years now, the last 5 of which I've been here at LDS. And I primarily work with students who are kind of grade 6 to kind of second year university. And I teach a pretty wide range of students, from students who have learning differences in math, such as dyscalculia, to students who are kind of in grade 10, maybe taking pre-calc 12 and getting a 95, 96% in it. So I teach a pretty wide variety of students, and many of them are affected by math anxiety, even students who perform very well in their academic math courses. Although the anxiety actually manifests a little bit differently between these kind of 2 discrete groups of learners. So we'll just have a very brief overview of what we're going to hopefully be able to cover all of today. So we're going to talk about, what is math anxiety, some of the causes, both things that are out of our control, unfortunately, and some things that we do have a little more power over. We're going to go over some ways that we can talk about math at home and relate math to our daily life at home, and some strategies for doing homework with children, which can be a challenging experience for parents and families to navigate that, especially as students enter high school and things become more challenging in their courses. Then finally, we're going to wrap it up with, I'm going to recommend a few activities, and Sarah Jane will come in and speak about some other supports that are available, and then we'll hopefully have time to answer all of your questions at the end as well. Just one comment as we move forward. Since we are here talking about anxiety, I want to be really open about the fact that I do have significant anxiety in speaking in front of people. So I apologize if I'm kind of tripping over my words a little bit. Okay, let's head on to our next slide. We're going to talk about, like, what is math anxiety and what are we referring to when we say this here. So math anxiety is anxiety that is specific to math here. And is distinct from generalized anxiety that is also applied to math. So in other words, we typically use this term to describe students who generally do not experience much anxiety in their day-to-day life, but experience large spikes of anxiety or tension or panic when they're confronted with mathematical tasks, math activities in school, or calculations in general. This may manifest in young people as anger, especially for boys and young men, because this is a socially acceptable way to show unpleasant emotions, or avoidant behavior to try to basically escape from the source of that anxiety or that stress there, whether it's homework, whether it's attending class, or anything else to do with math there. Okay, let's head to our next slide here. So we're going to be covering some systemic causes of math anxiety in our culture here. And these are generally things that we as individuals do not have the ability to impact here, but it's important to go through to understand some of the factors that are contributing to math anxiety in our society and in our educational systems here. So breaking this down here, we here in British Columbia have had a chronically underfunded education system for decades here. And over time, this has resulted in basically gaps that students have fallen through because supports have not been available to students as they need them. And this has really resulted in the situation that we are in today, where we have a massive crisis of math anxiety and math function here. And we'll get into some of the specific things here really briefly that other countries and other educational systems do that we do not, that explain a very significant portion of the achievement gap between Canada and other rich countries in math. So one of the key things here is that most countries who outperform Canadians in math actually have specialist math teachers from a young age. Yeah. They have found ways to funnel resources into their educational systems that allow for basically a minimum of a master's degree in math education to teach math even from an elementary school age. And this is a huge benefit to students. And I'm not trying to say anything bad about our elementary school teachers because they legitimately work as hard as they can. And they are also facing an underfunded education system and are doing the absolute best with the resources that have been made available. But it's also true, on the other hand, that they would be more supported if they had additional prep blocks and had another teacher handling some of the math instruction as well. And that's a really critical kind of distinction to make here, is that you don't need to really love math to be a good math teacher. But in educational systems where we do have this level of support, it does tend to help students to develop a positive relationship with math because they have more role models who have that positive relationship themselves. And the way that students actually learn math and relate to math is often modeled on their teachers and how their own teachers are relating to math. And it's a kind of compounding effect with that. This also comes to, there's another part of our education system which has become increasingly prevalent in recent decades, and especially in recent years. And this is sort of what we call the pass along system, which results in students being funneled through elementary school and later high school courses in a sort of sequential linear way up until it does branch out in grade 10 here in BC. And this was done as a result of several valid studies that were performed in previous decades that showed that keeping students with their grade level peers generally results in stronger performance. And however, though, this has a side effect that expectations continue to increase year after year, and students who did not receive the support that they needed in grade 3, for example, are passed along into grade 4 and into grade 5 and into grade 6. And because math is so cumulative, this compounds the challenges that they're facing and results in really unrealistic expectations, because students can't succeed in math if they're not equipped with the skills to actually do that math. And this is one of the things that causes so much anxiety in our young people today, is that they have this expectation that they can succeed in this system when the expectations are not necessarily realistic. And I'm not saying that they cannot be successful in learning math. No, that's the whole point of this, is they need that support. But without that support, just putting them into a classroom and expecting somebody who is having a lot of difficulty with fractions to be able to do like linear algebra or quadratic functions, that's not a realistic expectation for somebody who should be working on numeracy skills that they're going to need for their day-to-day life. There. And being anxious as a result of that is a very natural response to very high performance demands and a perceived inability to meet those demands. There. Okay, stereotypes. All right. I'm just going to say that when people think of a math teacher, they typically imagine somebody who looks like me. I'm going to be really honest about that fact. And for many of our students, though, who don't necessarily see themselves reflected in stereotypes about math, this can cause a lot of anxiety because there's something called stereotype threat. For example, for some women and girls, they have been bombarded with messaging about how boys are better at math and girls are better at reading, is a very unfortunately common message that young people get bombarded with in our culture. There. And this leads to something called stereotype threat, which isn't really built around stereotypes so much. This was just how it was first studied, where when you communicate to a group of people that they are not good at something, it places pressure on them to be like a representative of that identity group. And this, right, puts pressure on young people who are like, okay, I have to really excel at this because I want to show that girls can actually be good at math. Which anybody who's taught math knows this is like a bogus thing, and that there's not really much of an achievement, right? It's not a real thing, but it does become a perceived stereotype that some people internalize, and this adds to anxiety there. The last point I'm not going to get too much into here about the culture here, because this is a national and international aspect here of just our culture of relating to math. So I studied math in university. And when I tell people this, do you know what the most common response I get is? It's usually like, why? Like, why would you do that? Like, or they say, I could never be good at math and go and study that. Like, that's the most typical response that we get. Whereas in many other cultures, the response is more like, wow, I really was good at math in school. I had a very interesting conversation with a parent a short while ago who told me that everybody from her province that she was from, they were all good at math. And I'm sure there's a variation in ability, as with all things. But cultures that do speak positively about math tend to produce young people that are much less anxious about it. There. And okay, our last point here. I'm also not going to get too much into this. Math teachers. I'm not saying that there's math teachers out there deliberately causing people to be anxious. And I mean, there's probably, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but just the way that our educational system is set up encourages pedagogical practices and teaching practices that actually cause anxiety to spike. There have also been some research studies that are specific to certain groups that show that when young students are placed in an elementary school classroom with a elementary school teacher who has a high level of math anxiety, that they, by the end of the year, will pick that up. And this is not an intentional thing. The teachers are not trying to cause this, but the way that a teacher relates to math themselves, it's always going to be communicated unintentionally to the student, whether they are confident in themselves or not here. Okay, let's move on from here before I ramble too much. This is my thing, is I talk too much, is my biggest flaw. So yeah, let's talk about some of the pedagogical approaches that actually cause math anxiety here. So one thing would be putting an excessive focus on computation or calculation. Historically, this has been the case because the goal of our basically elementary and secondary schools has been to produce workers, essentially. And one of the skills that many jobs required in the 20th century was strong computational skills. And I mean, this is still true today, but it is much less true with the advent of calculators and other tools and software to do it. But our educational system has not really caught up with this, and especially not at the elementary school level. Because a lot of the times when math is being taught, it's being taught as an algorithmic approach, as in it's a series of steps you have to do, and the goal is to get the right answer here. And this really discounts pretty much everything that makes people good at math other than just calculating. And this is really, really unfortunate because, well, it's not fair to our students to do this. And I just want to illustrate this example with a little bit of a story from some current math research that's being done. Not on educational, but not on math education, but actual math research into open topics and math. There's a man named Jun Ha, and not to get too much into his backstory, but Jun Ha dropped out of high school as a teenager because he believed he was horrible at math. He couldn't calculate very well at all, really struggled with the drills that were very much the focus of his educational system. And 2 years ago, Jun Ha actually won the Fields Medal in Math, which is, for those of us here who don't follow math research, which I'm guessing is the majority of people in this call, it's kind of like the Nobel Prize, but the main difference is it's actually hard to win. And so Jun Ha, his path to math was he went into journalism and ended up, there was a very famous, also a Fields Medal winner from decades prior, who he had gone to interview and ended up talking. And this led to a long journey where he actually discovered that despite not being very good at calculating or computational skills, he was actually really good at math. And by our education system focusing in elementary school really very, very heavily on computation and not all the other things that you need, it makes students who follow, computation has a range of abilities there, and people can get better at it, but it's like a tiny part of the picture of being good at math. Because math is really about communicating ideas and understanding connections between concepts. And computation is all about working memory, typically, and following precise rules. And that's not the skill that you need, even really at a high school level, is not enough to really be successful, and certainly not in the real world sort of math that requires flexibility and critical thinking on there. But because our educational system really focuses on this, because it's much easier to grade than things like creativity or teamwork or, you know, helping others and, you know, doing your own research, looking things up on the internet when you're not sure what to do. These are all like parts of being good at math that are much harder to grade for teachers. And the easiest thing for teachers to do is to measure, okay, can you follow the steps of this algorithm? Can you combine two fractions? Whereas it's much harder to assess, do you understand that the bottom number on a fraction tells you how big the pieces are? And when you're comparing pieces of the same size, you can count them just as you can count units. It's much harder to assess that than it is to just give a student 1/3 plus 1/2 and expect them to just give you an answer there. And this really ties in with memorization as well, which is part of this, because there's very little to nothing in math that requires memorization if you understand where it comes from here. And as well, with speed over fluency, this again comes a lot of the time in terms of memorizing math facts. Memorizing math facts is valuable. I'm not going to say that it's not. But for some of our students with learning differences in math, this is something that they're going to have challenges with, right? And we don't want to have those students just fall completely behind and be feeling hopeless because they are taking longer to learn facts here. It also ties into the fact, like with our algorithmic approach, it's really built around the idea that there's one way to do a question correctly. Whereas like I see with students, they come up with ways to do things all the time that actually are mathematically valid, but they're not the same way that Simon Stevens said everybody should do math in the 1800s. Pretty much all of our algorithms come from one person that we teach in elementary school, who was Flemish from, I believe, the late 1700s, actually. And different countries actually have different algorithms for different things. And the ones we use in North America are typically ones that are very efficient to calculate for people who understand them, but not so good for teaching students how to actually understand the concepts. Okay, I'm going to stop talking about this now. Otherwise, I'm going to ramble like for the next while and get cut off by Sarah J. I will go back though and ramble a little bit more, sorry. She knows I talk too much. She's used to it. Anyway, the last point though was the silo teaching of math. And this is really a pervasive thing in our educational system, especially more so even in high school though than in elementary school, where because of the current grading scheme that has been adopted by the Ministry of Education, which I'm not going to get into because this is not meant to be like a political rally or anything like that. But the idea is that you have like maybe 7 or 8 core like units per year of a high school math course. And you move from one to the next, and each one is treated as its own separate concept. And then it doesn't come up again in the other units typically. And it's not typically explained the history of this, where did it come from, who discovered it, what were they trying to do with it, how does it fit into the culture of that society that came up with it. And this also leads to students who can get very high grades by cramming algorithms before a test, remember it for a week, go and write the test, get 97% in it, and then it's not going to come up on any further assessments, sometimes for 2 or 3 years. There's stuff from Math 9 that doesn't come up again until Calc 12, right? So it leads to like this short-term retention without long-term memory. And then when students get to Calc, there's 40 things in the tool bag that you're expected to know with no time to go and review them all. And then this is very overwhelming and anxiety-provoking. And this is part of the reason why we've got so many people in our society who their final experience with math is struggling with or failing a first-year college or university course in calculus. Okay, I'm done. I'm moving on, I promise. Okay, math at home. So our positive relationship with math starts at home here, because when children are very young, their parents are their, touch point for everything, pretty much, in figuring out how the world works at their youngest age here. And so obviously, a 2-year-old is not, I shouldn't say that. There are hypernumeric people out there who are very fascinated by math at the age of 2. But for a neurotypical child, a 2-year-old is not really going to have a relationship with math, right? People come into this world with no conception of quantities or numbers or anything. So one of the things that can make a really big difference from a young age is modeling a positive relationship with math, regardless of our own relationships with math. I mean, we can kind of put on a good face for our kids, right? And try to have a positive relationship with it there, because children take cues from their parents. And by approaching math in a way yourself where you show that, it's safe to make mistakes, or, right, if we don't know something, we can look it up instead of getting upset with ourselves. And if we get a wrong answer, we ask, what did we learn from that? And speak positively towards ourselves. So, right, just by even speaking positively about math at home, that kids pick up on things even when they don't seem to be listening to them. So the other thing, validate your child's feelings. This is more aimed at for older students who are already experiencing some anxiety. And one of the things that my students tell me that they're really happy with is when their parents understand and accept that. I'm not saying accept that your child is getting, is failing. That's not what I'm trying to say here, but accept that your child is having a hard time with it can really go a long way in just having your child feel heard in this, which is a really important step to feel like their parents at least know what they're going through with it, even if that doesn't make the problem go away. It can really help students feel less alone with that. For next point, I'm going to have some activities at the end that are kind of recommendations. I mean, you can do these with kids of all ages, but playing a board game with math or something goes over much better with younger children than with teenagers. I'll just leave it at that. Although, I literally just walked out of a lesson where I had a really positive experience with a 13-year-old who was doing an online math game, which it's not going to be included in this slide, but I'll mention it out loud as well. Some places that do have some not kiddie sort of stuff that is not overtly childish there. Okay, so talking about the math you use in daily life. I have a math anxiety screening questionnaire that I give to students. And one of my questions there is, the people in my family use math every day in there. And this is a really good talking point to get students speaking about their own thoughts about math, because generally you hear one of two things, right? My mom doesn't need math ever. Or it'll be something sort of niche my dad's a carpenter, so he does math at work there. But a lot of the time, just the day-to-day stuff of measurements required to make a recipe there, right, doesn't sort of trickle through that daily fraction use of a half a cup, a third of a cup. A lot of the time we just do these things ourselves without necessarily talking about them with our children. And this can lead to children forming opinions that are not even remotely true. I had a student once tell me that his dad was horrible at math. He didn't do any math at all. And then I met him 2 or 3 weeks later, and he was actually a mechanical engineer. And I remember I had a conversation with a student about it afterwards. And he had told me that, he's like, he's like, I've never seen my dad do math homework. Because that was what his idea of math was you sit down at the kitchen table and you do a worksheet. Whereas his dad was using software to basically do his engineering there. So like even just his dad was quite shocked by this, that this was the impression he had given off. But just being really like vigilant about like, okay, proactively like speaking about these activities. And even with things like just calculating tax at the store, for example, right? And things like that are daily things where, because we live in like one of the only countries in the world that doesn't put the tax on the prices, which again, I'm not going to make this a political thing, but it was a very petty move on the part of retailers to do that. I'll just say that. Yeah. And to also like talk about your own experiences. These don't have to be positive experiences as well, because like I'm sure there are people here who like experience or have experienced significant math anxiety as well. And sometimes the experience can be just something like along the lines of showing resilience of like, yeah, I found it really tough when I was in school as well. And right, like sharing that can also help like really to show that, you know, you have your own relationship with math, and, you know, you are, you know, being resilient and doing the best that you can. And that can help your child to form a like positive view themselves of how they relate to math. Okay, let's keep us moving here. Okay, homework. This can often be like the flashpoint for math anxiety in students and in parents as well. Because at a high school level and at an elementary school level, uh, especially with new ways of teaching, can look very different from the way that parents learned when they were students. And this can be very overwhelming for everybody in the family and can cause a lot of tension here. So I just have to say, it's okay not to know how to do it yourself. That's a totally valid thing to say here. And this is a great opportunity to model. How do we figure something out when we don't know how to do it? How can we look for help? Because I've met, okay, I shouldn't say I've never met. I've met one or two students who learn best from using textbooks. Pretty much all of the students that I've worked with do much better with things like video presentations. And in this day and age, I mean, the Surrey School District put out a whole video of the entire math curriculum designed for parents to help them watch with their students. And it's got about 50 views on YouTube because nobody knows that it exists. Which is like, honestly, like really tragic. I can't imagine putting like all those hours into making something like that, and then it just doesn't get marketed and nobody knows about it. But even just like publicly available, there are people who just go and make math teaching videos for fun. Like over 1 million people have passed calculus because of Professor Leonard. Just this one person making YouTube videos. And, you know, people also made videos for pretty much everything in high school, for fractions, for like anything you can think of. Somebody who enjoys math has gone and made videos explaining it, breaking down the concepts. And, you know, sometimes that skill of not knowing how to do it yourself is let's find a teacher who can explain it. And that's the sort of life skill that just passes for things other than math as well, right? And helps like young people build that like confidence in themselves, and kind of like that carry on mentality of like, okay, I'm a little stuck right now. That's okay. I have strategies I can use other than beating myself up mentally. Yeah, so empathize, be supportive and encouraging here. Yeah, model looking for resources and getting stuck. You know, like I make mistakes all the time when I'm teaching. Like I mentally calculate things and they come out horribly wrong. All of this stuff happens to me regularly. And this is actually a really important part of sort of working with students, is showing like a healthy response to something like that. To, especially the younger student is, the more receptive they are to like these scripts to see like, this is how I'm handling it here. And right, because a lot of the time with students, it's like their brain is telling them like, oh, I must be stupid. I can't even do this. Right, all of this negative self-talk And I mean, just saying to students like, okay, like, don't be so harsh on yourself. You might get them to stop saying it out loud, but they're still thinking it there. And so in order to like replace or help students manage that thinking, you have to give them an alternative way to like deal with these situations here. Okay. On a side note, I can't remember this if this is on the next slide or not, but I think it's important to mention here, regardless, is be really careful if you're telling your child that something is easy. It's really tempting to get into that when we're trying to be encouraging and supportive. Like, let's just get started, right? There'll be some easy ones at the top. This is probably the second or third thing that students most commonly tell me that their parents do that really is counterproductive. Because it does sound encouraging sort of on the surface, but for students who do make mistakes on those questions after being told they're easy, it's way worse of a feeling to be like, wow, I just got a question wrong that's supposed to be super easy, right? And it also like takes the satisfaction away of like, wow, I just did something really hard as well, which is right part of the something to feel good about when you're doing math is when you finally figure something out that's been challenging, right? So, but you don't have that like success feeling if you're thinking about everything you're doing as really easy here. Because frankly, everything in math is easy if you know how to do it, right? Like calculus is absolutely simple once you've learned how to do it. It's getting to that point that can be very, very difficult here. And telling Calc 1 students that it's easy is not a good motivating technique when they're in the trenches of trying to figure out how to do this stuff. Yeah. Okay. So removing parental stress from the equation here. This is the idea that like take care of yourselves as well, because it can be really stressful to have your child having a hard time in math here, and right, like just acknowledge that for yourself as well, that this can be a stressful experience for you. And like sometimes it's also a matter of like put on your own oxygen mask before you put on your child's. Like I really encourage parents to take a few minutes when they themselves are getting a little stressed out and to be aware of what the actual requirements to get into post-secondary are if you have teenagers here. Because it's a very different system in Canada than it is even in the US. And a lot of the parents and students I work with that are American are very, very focused on grades from a young age because that reflects their own educational system that they grew up in. Whereas in BC, universities only look at the grades from grade 11 and grade 12 on there. And so this is meant to be a way for students to learn without the pressure of grades from in those younger years. And so that people's futures are not like determined by being 14 and really lazy, in my case. So like university and all of post-secondary is a whole level of pressure when students are just trying to live up to the actual requirements for UBC. And sometimes parental expectations can exceed that and put more stress onto kids. Okay, yeah. And if you're helping, focus on coaching instead of on tutoring and being there would be my advice, because tutoring your own children, I would not recommend that to anybody, to be honest, because then there's just the personal dynamics as part of it, and I find my students do better when their parents are there to support rather than take on like an active pedagogical role in trying to do it. Figuring things out together is much more effective than like the parent trying to actually teach the material from the book there. And yeah, to really praise effort, and not just effort, but all the other things that are really good in math. Like I'm always saying to my students, like I can pretty much always find something positive to say about how they've approached something. Like whether it's like, I really like how you've done a good job organizing your thoughts. Look at how clearly you've laid out all of this material. like to that was a really good explanation of how you knew versus just like what did you calculate, right? Like you gave a really good explanation of why, two fractions have to have the same denominator before we can add them together. Like you gave me a really good explanation for that. Or like even sometimes it's like, that was a really creative solution. I'm at the point where like I rarely see new ways to make errors. It does still happen to me regularly, but it's much less common now. And even just seeing like a whole different way to think about it, like I can pretty much always say, okay, I can see your thinking and see why you've done that. And then I'll ask a follow-up question of like, okay, so what if we did blank then, to show that there's a little bit of a follow-up there that they can do. And then I'll say, okay, well, that's one way of thinking about it. Can I show you another here? Right. So find the positive things that you're seeing, even if it's also like, I can see you're working really hard at that. Like that's really valuable to point out. Okay, let's keep this moving. Okay. I think this is I'm going to turn this over. Oh no, never mind. This is me still talking at this point. There's more stuff I'm going to turn over later. Okay, so these are just like a few activities. I think we're sending out an email tomorrow, tonight, shortly in the next few days with some sort of suggested activities that you can do. Some are more academic, like the interactive simulations, right, are quite academically focused here, but do a good job in facilitating students in doing experiments to learn and learning their math through observing and seeing what would happen if I did blank in there, which with computers is much easier to do than with like pen and paper math. So they've actually created, I think it's the University of Colorado. Yeah, I would say Chicago for this. I know they're in different places, but okay. Right, to really play around with some of these concepts and try some things out there. Natural Math is I think they're a nonprofit. I'm not entirely sure about the tax status. And what they do is they produce math resources for younger kids, typically in the form of like books, not textbooks, but books full of like fun, hands-on activities for various age levels. Many of which are great to do like with your parents if you're a younger child here. And so this is just one of my ways of one of my suggestions for ways to establish like a positive relationship with math for a younger student here. Anyway, don't about finding these now. You will get an email with this stuff in the next little bit.
Great. Thanks, Patrick. If you guys have any questions, get those queued up because I'm just going to give you a couple other resources and then we'll hand it back to Patrick to answer questions or just have some conversation with you all. We wanted to just point out or say a little bit more about our Rise 1-to-1 program, because as Patrick has shared in stories, we are working with students who have learning challenges. They can be diagnosed or undiagnosed, so you don't have to come with a particular learning disability or difference, but you can be struggling in school and need some supports. And our Rise 1-to-1 program, as I said, available across BC, online, in person, all that good stuff. And that's one of the programs that Patrick and would work in, and many of our other instructors would work in. So I would just encourage you to look at that, to share with maybe other families, parents in your community that might benefit from that. All of our programs, the like Rise 1-to-1 and the family coaching, which I'll explain in a moment, all of our programs are on a sliding scale. So we are a nonprofit charity, and so we work really hard to make all of our programs accessible. So we don't want there to be any barriers for families and learners to get the support that they need. And then family coaching is if you're up against a wall or you're in some kind of a transition or you're struggling with communicating with your school or you're stuck on something and you're looking to get unstuck. It's an opportunity to meet with one of our team and to think through some of the best supports and help you make a next step. So I'd encourage you, again, check that out if that's something that could be helpful to you. And again, a little bit more about us. We also do professional development workshops all over the province in person and online. One of our key workshops right now is called Understanding Neurodiversity, where we introduce both concepts and understandings of how we support and honor and celebrate our neurodiverse friends, families, and learners. We work with educators on how to create inclusive environments for learning and what that looks like at different ages. So we do a lot of that work with educators, with schools, with community service societies, nonprofits, et cetera. And we also do some formal assessments, again, on a sliding scale. So we recognize there's a lot of challenges to getting some of those supports in the education system. So we have some ways that we can be supportive with executive function, assessments, KTA 3s, level B assessments, et cetera. And then we have lots of assistive technology, and that's one of the things that we can both help families figure out. How do we get the right technology in the classroom to support a learner? And even how do we try some of that out and figure out how to help learners where they are with technologies that make their learning more equitable. And this is just to let you know, we are a nonprofit. We do all these workshops for free. We put lots of time into it. If you happen to be able, willing, and interested, you can always donate. And as I said, all of what you give goes to our Bright Futures bursary, where we subsidize and support families to get the one-to-one support they need. Questions? Patrick. Thank you, folks, for being a small and mighty group. And feel free to take off your or to put your volume on and just ask your questions if there's anything you'd like to chat about. Patrick has lots of things he can chat about more, but we'd love to answer your questions.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you have any specific suggestions around getting supporting a student. So just for context, I have a student in grade 9 who does have some math anxiety, and a lot of it is around like overwhelm, just seeing, just even thinking about it and getting started is the biggest barrier. And there's a bit of sort of, that internal belief, like, I can't, I'm not good at this, and I know there's a bit of that, the confidence building piece is important, but I'm just wondering if, I know you shared a lot of great tips, but yeah, just wondering if you had any sort of specific strategies that you see as being really helpful with your students around just kind of getting to a place where they're actually ready to learn, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's really, like, for many students, that's the most pressing sort of thing, especially with anxiety. Often, like, well, anxiety in general, right? Like, it's often like the task initiation and the dread at the beginning is often like where anxiety is the worst there. So one of the things that I do with my students to kind of like conceptualize this a little bit, because at grade 9, that's sort of a transitional period for a lot of young people in that age of like 14, 15, sort of as they're growing. And one of the things that I do with my students is actually sort of track that, like how we feel as we do it, to sort of bring their attention to that. Because then it allows for like a conversation about like, okay, we know that this is going to be tough to start with. And building that in as like a, this is a tough thing to get started, but I know that once I get started, we'll get at least a bit better in there. But again, at 14, it can be tough to think ahead like that, especially when we're in an anxious state of mind. That is one strategy that I do, is yes, actually monitoring like how we're feeling as we're doing math to draw attention to that. I also, with students, it depends on the individual student, but one thing that can work with some students who are maybe a little more self-aware than average is to actually go and brainstorm together a little bit at that age of like, especially if it's related to, I feel really overwhelmed. Sometimes it can be a matter of what accommodations can we make that would make this less overwhelming. And so for many of my students, even things like calculators can be very helpful, right? For students who are facing that gap of like knowledge of math facts in there. And sometimes it's that, sometimes it's having like a worked example beforehand or doing the questions together. I find as well that like with task initiation for math, worksheets can be really triggering for anxiety. Like seeing a page full of questions and knowing that the ones at the bottom are going to be like the hard ones that are coming up like at the end can be really a lot. And so with this, what I'll often do with students is actually just not use worksheets or very minimally use pared down worksheets that only have like a little bit on each page there. So then it's also like, okay, we've just got this little bit to do here. And right, it's then can be like less overwhelming to get started when they're not seeing all of that. And starting out with, like I'll say to students sometimes, I'm like, would you like to do a review question together? Which is where I go with students and I go through some of the things we need to do to think about the question and talk it through together. But they know that I'm going to be there to, for example, do the algebra part. And oftentimes that's the overwhelming thing for students is some of that actual work down there. And they're more open to engaging with the question if they know that I'm going to do that part. And they're there to discuss, like, for example, with grade 9, like linear relations, right? Then we're going to be talking about like rate of change, right? And we can have a discussion about like, what is the rate of change represent in this? And then I will go and calculate that as a like stepping stone to getting started with that learning activity and do maybe 2 or 3 of those together before moving on to the actual, like, this is what our main goal of this is.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we had one in the chat. I'm trying to keep track of everything.
Yeah, so Patrick, you've said a lot of these things in the workshop, so I'm just wondering if there's anything else you want to add, because we just have a couple more minutes here. How could I better support my son at home in math that he'll learn better, faster, and confident in the correct way? So is there anything else you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, if you're looking to support at home, it is a bit of a broad topic, and I have talked about some of this before, but there is a really great resource called Desmos Classroom. And this has got learning activities. They're still developing them, like every month, new activities are coming out. And this is a pedagogy that's been developed by experts in the field of math instruction. And so it's really aligned with modern research into how students learn. And they've got some pretty like actually fun math games as well. Not like the sort of, you go to coolmathgames.com and a lot of it is just like glorified flashcards. I think we got the spelling is Desmos. You will get a link to this as well. Will go out. So if you don't get this jotted down in the next minute, that's okay. Like I had a student the other day who actually they've got a game where you try to launch marbles into containers using linear algebra. And it's actually a really engaging activity for like people who are in early high school to go and try to figure out these puzzles basically. And beyond just like, they'll put something up and be like, oh, what is the slope of this line? Which is basically like a glorified question bank. Not something you can like really have much fun with. just as well in general, like lots of card games have quite a bit of math in them, like traditional like card games, things like cribbage, 99 for like young kids. That can be a really good way to build fluency as well, in a way that's fun and not just like flashcards. Okay, I'm just keeping an eye on the time. Sarah Jane, where are we at here?
I think we're ready to conclude unless there's any other questions. As Patrick said, we will put together some of these resources and we will share a recording of this. It will be the next few days or the latest early next week. And then you're welcome to obviously view that, share that. Yeah, Patrick, is there anything else that you wanted to share?
Yeah, I just wanted to just share a really like heartfelt thank you for all taking some time out of your evening to come here and listen to me talk about something really important. I always love having the opportunity to do that. And yeah, thank you all. Seriously, thank you. And thank you so much for the feedback. This really means a lot.